about a year ago or so, if I remember correctly, and it got a lot of publicity. But this is actually a school in India, and within the school there is a test happening, which if I remember correctly, it was an admissions test for higher education. And what you see there is you see family members literally scaling the walls in order to try to find their other family members and to provide assistance while students are taking the test. And so I think if we're looking for an illustration or a way to highlight how motivated people are to find any advantage on any of the assessments that we give, I think this is a great example of the lens that people will go to and the reason why what we're talking about today is so critical. And so I just thought that might be a nice way to kind of start off and highlight the need for this. So when we start talking about security, whenever we do that, we like to talk about security. We like to have it embedded within a conversation about test score validity. When we start talking about test score validity and how a test is being used and whether or not it's appropriate and valid for a given test, we talk about security being an essential part of that. Validity really comes down to, are the scores on your test appropriate for the given use that you're talking about? And anything that takes away from that, anything that takes away from the fact that your test score reflects the knowledge, skills, and ability of your candidates, that's going to take away from your test score validity. And so if people are walking into your test administration and they have pre-knowledge of the content of your test and are getting items correct because of that pre-knowledge, that's degrading the validity of your test. And so when we start talking about security and why it's so important, it's because it's not just a matter of a given student getting an advantage. It's actually literally the heart of the use of your test. And so that's why security is so critical. So we talk about the three critical components of security, which are prevention, detection, and enforcement. And so these are all going to be interrelated areas, and so we'll talk about different components of each of them. I am going to focus more of my time on this detect area than anywhere else, but I will talk about prevention, I will talk about enforcement and investigation and things like that today. Before getting into some of the conversation about those different components, I just want to mention a little bit about Alpine because I think it helps frame some of what we'll be talking about and some of kind of where I'm coming at when we have this conversation. Within Alpine, we do work with a fairly wide variety of clients. My experience, which is lengthier than I would quite frankly like to admit, given the sheer amount of time I've been around at this point, has been mostly in education. I've done some work in credentialing, but certainly predominantly on the education side. Whereas within Alpine, we have people who do work in licensure, we have people who do work in professional credentialing, in IT certification, and actually it's been one of the things in my time at Alpine, I've been here for about 2.5 years, that I've really enjoyed because it gives you an opportunity to hear about and to experience what other people are doing, how they're delivering tests, how they're developing tests. And so I think that nice wide range of experience helps to provide us some context for some of the work that's happening. As an example, in education, certainly over the past few years, there's been a ton of change happening with the introduction of the Common Core, new assessments that are happening, and as education is moving in this direction, they're increasingly going to a computer-delivered model. In education, there are certainly challenges to doing that as far as just the sheer number of resources required, the number of people who are needed, just getting enough computers to handle this large number of candidates. And so I think the education sector is kind of struggling through that process right now as we're talking about, whereas in IT, they've been doing it for so long. They've got a lot of things kind of figured out. They've got a lot of models in place. And so I think while I'm on the education side, I've been able to lean on some of my colleagues in the IT credentialing area as we've worked with a couple different people as they've moved from paper and pencil to CBT, and it's been particularly beneficial. And I think security and the processes that are in place is a good example of that. So let's talk a little bit about security and what kind of work that we can do. As we go through this, thinking a little bit about that prevention component and what we can do when we start talking about trying to prevent people from cheating or people from gaining access to the content of your test. And certainly this is one that we could spend an awful lot of time with, but I'll kind of highlight a couple key areas here for you. One thing that I would want to highlight and want to point out for everybody is that it's absolutely essential that you take a little bit of time and spend the time to identify your primary threats, your primary and secondary threats. Certainly, as you go through this process, you could end up in a situation where you're going to have almost every threat out there being labeled as a primary threat. But I think, nonetheless, taking the time to identify all of those possible threats, as well as how they would play out, is going to be a critical part for that, because it's going to tie you in and point out the data that you're going to need to collect, the information that you're going to need to collect, the administration model that you're going to need to think about, the weaknesses that you have. And so just going through and taking the time to identify all of those different threats that you have to think about is going to be a critical part of your process. Another area that you could spend, literally we could have a whole webinar on this, is just kind of item banking and policies there. When we start thinking this, the number of items needed and how you can handle the development of those items is certainly going to be a challenge in any environment, but it's absolutely critical to the security of your overall program. So when you look at different programs, and so let's go to a model where you're delivering a computer adaptive test, and you've got a test that's going to be roughly 40 items in length, and for simplicity purposes, let's make them all multiple choice items. There are models out there that would say that you need approximately 12 times the number of items that you're going to deliver. So you would need 12 times 40 items in order to have an item bank that is sufficient to allow items to be given to students or given to candidates and not have those items overexposed. There are other models out there that will talk not necessarily about the sheer number of items that you need in your item bank, but we'll also talk about how you can rotate your item banks. And so you can have literally 2 different sets of item banks, or even more than 2 sets of item banks. Pool A gets used for a certain period of time and then gets kind of decommissioned for a little while Pool B gets used. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can handle your item bank that are going to be essential as far as thinking about the prevention of cheating for your examination. Along those same lines, there's a lot of different models out there for the delivery of items. And so if you've got a computer adaptive test, for example, and you're thinking about how to select items, there are ways you can select items, and there's dangers in the ways you select items where, if you're not careful, certain items from your item bank will become the primary items or will be selected at an extremely high rate. You have certain items that provide a lot of information and are very valuable. And if you're not careful, those items will get selected over and over again at the beginning, and those items will quickly get exposed. And so what you can do is you can create policies or you can create algorithms that control for that. And there are literally hundreds of different ways to think about controlling for item exposure in a computer adaptive test. That will be an essential part that you'll want to think about as you're going through and developing your program. In addition to computer adaptive testing, there's a lot of other different models out there. There's something called content mastery testing, where you're going through and providing testlets. And so there's a lot of different models out there for administering the test itself that you can think about as far as trying to control and prevent cheating on your test. A couple other critical parts, not related to the item bank or how you're going to deliver the test, that I would want to highlight is really focused on the training of what you're doing with candidates, with your proctors, with your test administrators. And it's absolutely essential that you have rigorous and thorough training procedures in place, and so that people understand how they should be using materials, how they should be logging into systems, how they should be logging people out, when people can sit and take the test, how long they have, when they need to be kind of kicked out of the system and things like that. So the training of all your administrators is going to be an absolutely critical part of that. And then finally, the scoring. Obviously, that's going to be an absolutely critical area. You've got scoring keys that could potentially be exposed, and controlling for the exposure of that is absolutely going to be a critical part of your prevention. In addition to those areas, I wanted to mention just briefly something that we had a fair amount of exposure to over the past year, which are DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks. I am not going to present myself here as an expert on this area, but I think it's so important and I think it's so potentially disruptive, I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. Over the summer of last year, we did a fair amount of work in the state of Florida, and one of the reasons why we ended up doing that work is when they were administering their statewide assessment in the spring of 2016, they had a number of challenges related to that, one of which was a series of DDoS attacks. So these DDoS attacks are distributed denial of service attacks. And basically what they're doing is you've got some sort of malicious party who has decided that in order to, for whatever reason, for whatever motivation they may have, they've decided that they're going to try to disrupt the administration of the test. And what they can do is they can flood the bandwidth of your delivery engine to such a degree that when people are legitimate testing sites are trying to log in and administer the test, they're unable to do so. And so it literally is a situation where you've got this pipeline, and that pipeline just becomes so flooded by junk from somebody, all other activity is either impossible or next to impossible. Now, unfortunately, these type of attacks are not that difficult to do. And I think even worse, they're incredibly hard to predict. There's not an easy way to absolutely remove this threat from happening. And I think the threat is even more real in scenarios where you've got kind of a more prominent or a more publicly known assessment. And so, for example, in the state of Kansas, a couple of years ago, they had a serious problem with DDoS attacks. The state of Florida this last year and some other states had people who were kind of going in and messing with the administration that was happening for just malicious, horrible reasons because they just thought they're doing so. And so, unfortunately, I think a lot of people were under the impression that they could kind of set up a firewall and that would prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, the firewall certainly helped. But what's happening is the firewall kind of needs to also be adjusted in a fairly quick turnaround. And so I think the reason I wanted to mention this, because it is such a risk and it is potentially so disruptive. For those parties who are working in an area where this is a real risk, you've really got to build it into your plan and have a system in place where these can be identified very quickly. Because once you've identified where the DDoS attack is coming from, you can adjust your firewall and you can kind of push those people out. But until that happens, it can be incredibly disruptive. And so making sure that you have that plan in place before your administration begins is absolutely critical, because if you're not careful, you kind of go through the process where you say, okay, hey, what the hell is happening? I don't understand why people are having trouble logging in. I don't understand where all this bandwidth is getting eaten up. And so you have to go through kind of the discovery process right at the beginning if you're not careful. Whereas if you've got a plan in place right from the beginning, you can curtail it much, much quicker. And so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that as one thing that you would want to be thinking about as you're thinking about your security plan. So in addition to thinking about kind of that prevention side of things, I wanted to mention a little bit about the enforcement or the investigation that you would want to be thinking about as well. I just want to highlight kind of a couple key things here. One thing that is absolutely essential I mentioned before kind of identifying your primary and your secondary security threats. And I think that is also related to here, because I think the reason why you want to take the time to identify those threats is you've got to kind of map out each threat with how it would be enacted, along with how the enforcement against that threat would happen. Because you've got to sit down and think about the data that you have available to you, the information that you have available for all of your candidates, to make sure that it's comprehensive in the event of a security breach, and that you're able to gather and have all of the information that you need. Just as a kind of a fairly easy example, if you've got information that tells you that a candidate took a test on a given date at a given site, that certainly could be critical and useful information. But if you're not careful and all you have is the test administration site, there may be multiple rooms within that test administration site. And if you don't have that information, that could severely curtail your ability to complete some of the investigations that you need. Or if you don't have the exact time that the person sat down and took the test, if it was a session where everybody was taking the test together, if you have that session identification number, if it's a time where people can kind of come in and take the test as they kind of roll in, and you don't have the exact start and the exact stop time, that can again cause serious problems with investigations. And so you've got to sit down and say, okay, what data and information do I need to make sure that I have in place in the event a security breach does happen? A couple other things to highlight. One thing when you're thinking about investigations is the transparency of those investigations and making sure that people are aware of the activities and the data that were used in the investigation and how any investigation kind of reached its conclusion. You have to kind of work on the assumption that people will have full kind of disclosure to what you're looking at in order to support any conclusions that you reach, and also make sure that people are fully informed of it prior to actually taking the test. And so within all of your investigation, within all of your enforcement activities, that idea of transparency will be absolutely critical. I think, again, it might be reflecting the education side of things more than others. I think given how public-facing everything is in education, that need for transparency is going to be absolutely critical, because there's going to be kind of public requests for information that you're going to have to think about and be aware of as we move forward. One last note when thinking about investigations, something that you probably want to make sure that you keep in mind or that you've defined prior to your test administration are things like roles and responsibilities in the event of a security breach. And the reason I wanted to mention that is you can sometimes run into a scenario where you have a security breach and you've got a team of people who are responsible for the administration of a test. But now the access to data and information about specific people, about specific instances, or certain, certain data, certain people is going to be restricted. And you could potentially have a scenario where people used to have access to all of the information and used to have access to all of the data, but now, whether they're the subject of the inquiry or not, all of a sudden it's restricted. And you end up in a situation where people are frustrated, people are angry because they're not able to necessarily get the data and information that they used to have. And if that happens all after the fact and people aren't aware of that well beforehand, I think you can run into kind of some serious political issues if you're not careful. And certainly in my experiences, whenever you try to kind of pull data back and you haven't told people in advance that this could happen, it becomes extremely problematic. And you have certain people who will kind of take offense and could potentially really get in the way of your investigation activities. And just something else for you to think about as you're going through this process. So kind of moving forward, thinking a little bit more and moving on to detection, I want to talk a little bit about kind of content detection. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about, test items appearing on websites. We're talking about, God forbid, answer keys appearing on websites and things like that. And so one of the critical activities that you'll want to build into any security plan is figuring out ways to actually do the work necessary to think about how can we search for content, how can we ensure that content is not appearing on websites and available to people before they come in and take our test. And this is certainly a very challenging component because you're literally trying to control the web. And so certainly that's going to be incredibly difficult. But there are systems for web crawling that can certainly help in this scenario. And you can do things like set up Google Alerts that certainly can help in that matter. So I think there are definitely activities that you would want to build in to your process. But unfortunately, there's also just the manual challenge of once you discover that content, what do you do? How do you work with the website? Do you, threaten lawsuits? How do you get lawyers involved? When do you get them involved? How do you get material removed? That all can be quite a challenge and quite labor intensive for people. And so that's certainly an area that is going to be something that you'll have to spend a lot of time on. One thing that we've heard a few people do and have had some fairly good success with to consider is the idea of actually going to the website's third party. And so the example is a payment vendor. And so if you've got a website and they are continuously posting content from your assessments, and you can threaten lawsuits, you can do what you can, and they will occasionally remove materials and things like that. But you've got problems where just getting this website to comply is proving difficult. In some scenarios, it might be worth considering talking or checking in with people who are doing payment, explaining to them that some of the websites, so this given website that they are working with, is working in a way where there is a threat of copyright infringement. And the third party, the vendor, may find that to be more problematic than the website itself. And so there might be ways for you to actually go and talk to other folks who are essential for the website being able to function that might be more effective in some ways. And so again, this is a real challenge, and ideas like this might help you to move forward as you're thinking about trying to handle the content sharing that happens out there. Moving forward, I want to talk a little bit more about the statistical analyses that you can perform when you're thinking about detection. And certainly when you start thinking about all of the statistical techniques that are out there, they can be incredibly powerful, and they can be incredibly useful when you're thinking about setting up your security program. When you have all of this data and you're able to run through and look at the performance of all of your candidates on all the items, you can go through this very rigorous security protocol in a fairly efficient way. Given that basically you're just taking item responses, compiling them, running them through, and getting output, it seems incredibly quick, especially when you start thinking about all the work required to monitor content on the web and things like that. The idea of doing statistical analyses is fairly minuscule as far as the time and effort required. Now, certainly, this is not to say that you can only do the statistical analysis and kind of walk away happy. There's always going to be a lot of different components to this. But certainly, the power of the statistical analyses that we have available and their ability to look at every single person across every single item, across groups of people, is incredibly useful for this. One thing to mention, again, from the education side of things, I think in a lot of cases the statistical analyses can be used, but there's still going to be an incredibly kind of labor-intensive investigation required. You hear about scenarios where certain public school districts, for example, there was collusion within schools or things like that. And unfortunately, these methods don't eliminate the need for that. There's nothing that can eliminate the need for that. So there's always going to be a need for multiple pieces of evidence when you're dealing in certain environments. So we'll always need to have further data and information. So when we start thinking about the statistical methods and we start thinking about kind of key threats or key areas that we need to be concerned about, We talk about kind of the item and the test content getting exposed. And so if you have a open testing window and you've got the test being given over a period of a month, or you have a continuous testing window where candidates can come in and if they want to get licensed, they can come in and take the assessment at any time. And so over time, as new content gets released, it could get exposed, whether that be through just informal communication from one student to the next, one candidate to the next, or a more kind of active people trying to actually share that content. And that can happen at both the content at the test level and the item level. You can also have a scenario where people are, the good old-fashioned copying from one student to the next, one candidate to the next, and so they're sitting next to each other and they are trying to share how they selected on each items, and so you just have that kind of classic good old-fashioned cheating happening during the test administration. And then you also have the scenario where you've got people kind of walking in the door with pre-knowledge, and so they may know an answer key before they walk in the door, or there may be a situation where they know the certain items are going to appear on the test, and so they know that these 10 items are going to appear and they're ready for those 10 items, or they may have knowledge of a performance item, they may have knowledge of just one or the entire test. And so all of these different areas can obviously be incredibly disruptive as you're going through the test administration process. So what can we do about it, and how can we start looking for these type of things? So one of the basic things that we can do, which will be absolutely critical, is really just looking at the performance of your items and your test forms, and looking at them as they're released and as they go throughout their entire life cycle to see if you see any changes. And so you can look at both the item and the test form level to see if things are moving as you move forward. And so let's imagine you've released a new test and it's January 5th of this year, and you have a wave of people who come in and take the test in the first couple of weeks. You gather data from the first week and see how the items perform, see how the test performs. And now you can do it later. It's now February. You can look again and see how your tests and how your items are performing. You can actually do this on a continuous basis. If you have a system set up appropriately, you can be doing this on a daily or a weekly basis in a fairly seamless fashion, depending on how often people are taking your test and how critical it is to identify. So what type of things can we look at? So let's imagine that you want to look and see how your items are performing. And you want to make sure that certain items are not getting exposed and that items are not kind of getting out there. A real simple way to do that is to look at the difficulty level of your item. When we start talking about the difficulty level of the item, the easiest way to think about that is just how many people are getting it correct. And so you'll hear psychometricians like myself talk about a p-value. The p-value is really just the percent of candidates who get an item correct. And so imagine a simple multiple choice item, and you just go through and you say, okay, 65% of candidates on this given item got this correct. That is your p-value, and that is your estimate of how difficult your item is. A fairly simple way to think about whether or not items have been exposed is just keep track of that p-value. So on a weekly basis, you compile data, you look at how many people have taken the test, how many people have taken a given item, and you look to see if that p-value has shifted. So if you see it going from 65% to 70, 75, 80, 85, and you see it kind of gradually moving up where more and more people are getting that item correct, that can be an indication that that item has been exposed or is kind of out there. And so if people are looking at websites and that's one of the items that they're seeing on the website, that could be having an impact on the overall performance of the item. And so that's a fairly simple and clean way for you to think about, hey, is there anything happening with this given item? Another way that you can think about looking at specific items is through the item score correlation. Now this is not quite as intuitive as looking at the difficulty, but let me see if I can explain it in a way that's fairly clear. What we're doing when we're looking at the item score correlation is we're checking to see if people who got a given item correct are more likely to perform well on the test. And so from a logical perspective, you would expect those candidates who do well on a test to be more likely to get an item correct. And so your item score correlation is really just looking at that and it's saying, yes, if the value is high, better candidates, those who scored higher on our test, are more likely to get this given item correct. So you can have and look at that item score correlation just as you do with the item difficulty. Now the reason this can be valuable for cheating and security is if that number starts to decrease or degrade, that can be an indication that something's going on with the item. Because if that number goes down and it kind of plummets, what that says is that performance on that item is not in any way affiliated with how people perform on the test. And so you no longer have a situation where better candidates are getting this item correct. Because what could happen is it's not better candidates who are getting it correct. Better candidates maybe, but those who have some sort of pre-knowledge that that item is going to appear are getting that item correct. And so because they're getting the item correct, the relationship between the overall score is now all thrown off. And so if you see that item score correlation changing over time, you could have an indication that something is going on with that item and that you have some sort of problem with the item. So those are fairly easy, and as I said, you can do this fairly seamlessly as far as looking at the performance of your items as you're going through your entire testing window. Another thing that you can do is look at the performance of the overall test. So this is a graph that I quickly just showed you, which says, hey, how do people perform on the overall test itself? When I do that, we see so many people. When you see this incredibly high jump of people all the way at the end, where you've got 65, 70 items correct, or 65, 70 on the score. When there's that many people and such a disproportionate number of people are getting perfect scores or such high scores, that could be an immediate flag for you to be nervous and concerned that something might be happening on your test. And just as we can do with item information, we can look at test score information and say, okay, do we see any changes happening? And so the top graph that I showed you there is just the average score as you move across administrations, as you look at the number of administrations. And so what you can see on that top graph there is you can see that line kind of gradually moving up. And people, as the number of administrations increases, the mean score on that test, or the average score on that test, is gradually moving up as well. Again, this isn't an absolute certainty that there's something happening with your test, but certainly that is an indication that somehow maybe people are getting some information and knowing what's happening before they walk in the door, and that's helping them on the test. You'd much rather see a situation with that bottom graph there where it's very much a straight line. And so as you increase the number of administrations on that bottom line, you see the mean score really not moving around and not really kind of drifting upwards or downwards. And so that top graph, again, could be an indication that perhaps something is happening with your test that maybe you want to look at a little bit closer as you're moving forward. Another thing that you can look at is the test score for candidates by the amount of time that they've taken on the test. And so candidates are coming in, students are coming in, taking the test. One of the incredibly useful pieces of information that you can get is the amount of time that any candidate spends on a given item, or the amount of time that they spend on the entire test. And that can be incredibly useful because if someone is kind of coming in and taking absolutely no time on a given item, that could indicate that perhaps they're not even trying, they're just answering A for every single multiple choice item, but it could also be an indication that they've got a kind of a key in their mind already and they know what's happening, and they're just completing the test, answering the key and not even looking at the item. And so the graph here is actually an example of what you would normally see when you're not really concerned. And so as you move up as you go up vertically, you can see the scores are increasing from 0 all the way up to 70 here. And those candidates who scored really well on the test are not kind of clumped anywhere. You see them taking 20 minutes to 60 to 80 minutes across a fairly wide range of time. On the other hand, if you have a situation that looks a little bit like this, perhaps this is a little bit of a flag for you to get a little bit concerned, because you've got a situation where your percent score is going all the way up here to approximately 100%, and you've got a really big cluster of people who are not taking much time at all and getting almost or perfect scores. And so it could indicate that they're not even bothering to read the item. They're just going through, answering, using the answer key that they've been provided. And in some ways, that pre-knowledge of what they're coming in with is being indicated by the two pieces of information there. So again, this is not perfect information. It does not guarantee that you know exactly what's happening. But again, it's another strong indicator that you can gather that there might be something happening with your overall test that you would want to look closer at. So those are a couple things that you can be looking at when you're looking at your items or when your test, and whether or not those might be exposed. But on the other hand, you can also look at the candidates and start thinking about, okay, what do we need to gather in order to evaluate anything that's happening there, if people are cheating, or if they're coming in with any sort of pre-knowledge. And when we start thinking about candidates, we could have a situation where they're actually trying to cheat on the test. They're sitting in the administration, copying from someone sitting next to them, or they could be coming in with that pre-knowledge that I've mentioned. When we're talking about copying answers, what we end up looking at primarily here is pattern of item responses. And so you can take a look and see if you have the administration information and you know where people are sitting when they were taking the test, who else was in the room with them. You can compare a given candidate or a given student's response times with those who are sitting near them. And if you see kind of an unnaturally clustered group of responses, that could be an indication that there was somehow sharing going on within that setting. That can be done looking at correct items. That can be done looking at incorrect items. When your people are getting it incorrect and consistently incorrect, and that can be an even stronger indication that there was some sort of copying going on. One caution to note when you're thinking about looking at response patterns, in some scenarios, this isn't common, but it has happened where you've got within a given school, with a given teacher, you've got some sort of law of teaching. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but I think it is, where you have students being consistently told something, and then what they're being told is actually wrong. And so you could end up having all students from a given classroom answering the same question wrong, which might look funny and might look like there's some sort of collusion happening, but in fact it just reflects the curriculum of the given school or the given class. And so just something to think about when you're thinking about looking at all these item response patterns. When we start thinking about pre-knowledge, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And this is when people are actively looking at websites, working with them, gathering information, or they're working together within a school, within a set of candidates, and they're sending people in early in administration and gathering that information in that process. So in some way, shape, or form, they have information that tells them what is going to be on the test before they walk in the door. And so what can we do about that, and how can we possibly detect that? And so I'm going to explain a little bit of work from a couple of my colleagues here at Alpine, Lisa O'Leary and Russ Smith. They've done some really cool work in this area and they've actually got a book chapter that's going to be coming out later this year focusing on it, and they've done some really neat stuff, and I'm basically kind of plagiarizing from them a little bit here by going through this. Lisa and Russ have done some work, and what they're doing is they're looking at something called differential person functioning, as well as something that's called differential item function. When you're looking at differential person functioning, what you're doing during that process is you're trying to identify, you're looking at specific items and trying to say, are there people, and looking at items that have been exposed versus items that have not been exposed. In this scenario, what we're, I guess, let me take a step back. I should mention, the scenario that we're talking about here is a scenario where a test form has been released and is kind of actively being used, but we're now introducing new items into the test. And so those new items are items that we could call classify as kind of unexposed, whereas any item that has appeared on the test already is exposed. And that's going to be critical because those unexposed items, those brand new items, are going to be kind of your control in this situation because no one can walk in with pre-knowledge of those items. So now what we're going to be able to do is look at every specific candidate and compare their performance on those exposed items versus the unexposed items. And in addition, where it gets interesting is once we have that information about candidates, we can then start looking at specific items and see if we can start identifying specific items that have been exposed. And so I think that may sound a little bit confusing, but I think I can show you a couple graphs that will look and kind of clear this up nicely for everybody. And so here's a graph of the type of information that you can get from differential person functioning. In this case, the y-axis is the unscored items, whereas the x-axis, the horizontal, is the scored items. Now, in theory, candidates on all items, whether they're scored or unscored, should be performing roughly the same. And candidates who perform roughly the same are identified by that line that runs throughout the graph. And not too surprisingly, you're going to see some people clustering around it. Not people are going to be landing directly on the line. But what you see for all of those candidates who are highlighted there in yellow, you're seeing those candidates doing significantly better on the scored items or the exposed items than the unexposed items. And what that could indicate is that those exposed items, perhaps those candidates are walking in with pre-knowledge about those items. So they're doing really well on those exposed items, but they're not doing so well on those unexposed items. So you've got an indication that those candidates have some sort of unfair advantage on that you need to investigate further. So taking it a step further, the other nice thing is now you've got two groups of candidates. You've got candidates who are kind of have pre-knowledge, other candidates don't have pre-knowledge. You can now start looking item by item. And you can start saying, okay, which of these items appear to have been exposed? And in this case, again, using that yellow group of items, those are items where those candidates who had pre-knowledge, or we believe have pre-knowledge of the items, are doing notably better than those who did not. And so using what Lisa and Russ have come up with, the really cool part of this, and I admit this is a psychometrician using the term cool, is that you can not only identify candidates who appear to have some sort of pre-knowledge, but you can actually look specifically at items and see which items you believe have been exposed. And so I think I would highly encourage you to take a look at some of the work that Russ and Lisa have done over the past couple of years. There's a number of their presentations on our website that are worth going and looking at. In addition, the book chapter that I mentioned will also be of interest for everyone. So I think I'm running a little bit longer than I expected, so I'm just going to mention real briefly this last bit of information. I mentioned the statistical analyses, and one of the powers of the statistical analyses is that you're able to build them into your scoring process. And I think, as an example, here's a hypothetical list of analyses that could be performed even before scores are released. And so you can do all of these types of analyses to see if you've got good data for a given candidate before you give them their final score. For example, you could look at, I mentioned looking at how much time is spent as well as their score. And if you've got candidates who are scoring exceptionally high, getting a perfect score, but spending a minimal amount of time, that could be a flag that you want to go back and look closer at their performance or do some sort of further investigation on what is happening there. On the other hand, you could also look at something like differential performance on specific items or item types or item content. So you could be looking at how people are performing on those scored versus unscored items or exposed versus unexposed items. And these could be critical flags that you could build into your scoring process as a way to potentially identify candidates who might have an unfair advantage when they've walked in the door. And so these are all different ways you could do that. And again, I just wanted to highlight that as a way to kind of wrap up and explain the different statistical analyses that could be performed. So I think with that, I think I should probably wrap it up and open it up to questions if there are any. While I'm not sure if there are procedures or if people should be, I think you mentioned that they should be kind of virtually raising their hand if they want to. I'm looking at the screen here, and there's a question that I'm just reviewing right now. One case, the candidate has to prepare for an exam, they better will perform on the exam. We have found that initially really low scores, but over time you'll see an increase. I agree that it can be cheating, but a slight increase over time could be normal. So I was just reading one of the questions that is in the chat. And an individual mentioned that in their situation, as you open up the window, it could be a situation where people are kind of exposed to the new content and now have an opportunity to prepare for it. And it's not cheating where people are seeing an increase in their scores. It's instead they've had an opportunity to see what's on the test, better prepare for it. And that's the reason why you could have an increase in the overall scores. And I think that is correct. I think in many situations you can have a situation like that. I think another thing that can happen is you can see an initial spike, actually, when you first administer the test where candidates do particularly well, because you have a group of highly motivated, high caliber candidates who want to come in and take the test right away, and then you see a little bit of a lull. And I think the point you make is very important, and I think it is a reason why when we're looking at some of these indicators, none of them should be considered absolute. This means people are cheating or something is happening. It's always an indication that perhaps something is happening and you want to look closer, but it's not an absolute certainty that it's a function of someone cheating. So actually, I just received a text message from Lana, and it looks like she's having difficulty on her end, and she's not able to unmute for some reason. So I think I don't see any other questions, but I do want to give people an opportunity. If you have any questions that you could put in the chat, we can address them. I see one question popping up. Just give me 1 second, please. That's yes, in the Smith and O'Leary and Smith work, what they were doing, they do have new items, and so one thing that you do have to control for is anytime you're getting brand new items and they've never been tried out, you could have some items that don't perform so well. And so traditionally what you do is you take a look at item performance and you can remove those before they would be seen. But what you can do within the work that Lisa and Russ did is you can provide those unexposed items, and before you complete your analysis, you can remove the poorly performing items. And so if the items are too difficult, too easy, any reason why you would want to remove those items can be done before you do all of those analyses. Okay, I think given Juana is not able to unmute, I think I will, up on your screen, I left my email address. I'd be more than happy to speak with anyone, or feel free to reach out to Alpine to discuss any of these options if you would like any further information. I do know that Juana will be posting the webinar on the website. I don't know the exact time frame for when that will happen, but I know it will be up on our website fairly shortly. She also mentioned registering for the February webinar, which we'll be doing, so please feel free to reach out directly to Juana and to set up that registration for our future work. I think with that, I will say thank you very much and allow all of you to jump off the phone and enjoy the rest of your day.